This is Your Money, Your Call.
Good evening and welcome to Your Money, Your Call. I'm Chris Gray. On tonight's property edition of Your Money, Your Call, tonight's show we'll be taking a look at the options for those people wanting to dip a toe into the property developing world. How much risk is it to become a property developer, and how can you take the first few steps in the easiest possible manner? Now, joining us on our panel of experts tonight is Joe Chivers from Property Bloom. You're the property developing side of the panel tonight. Can you give us a bit of an idea of the background so that viewers know what questions to ask you?
Yeah, sure, Chris. Well, I started out really as just an investor myself about 10 years ago. I decided that we needed to build our investment portfolio, so I did an intense property investment course which showed me a whole heap of different strategies that you can use when investing in property. I actually started off with buying off the plan. This is back in 2000, and from there I built our own personal portfolio, and then after buying 4 properties in Sydney, which ended up being fairly negative for me at the time, realised that I can't keep buying negatively geared properties. So I looked outside of Sydney and sort of went to a 2-hour radius around Sydney, found the Hunter region, and bought my own property there, developed that, and really that's how I got started in developing.
No, good, and we'll go through some examples of that later on. Now, you've got 2 books here that we'll put up on the screen, Property is a Girl's Best Friend and also Property Millionaire as well. Do you want to tell us a bit about what's inside these books?
Oh yeah, I was invited to co-author both the books. So the first book, Property is a Girl's Best Friend, is a really great guide for first-time investors or just people wanting a general information about a range of different topics. And I've written the chapter on subdivision and development, and the Property Millionaire book was put together to feature a whole range of different people who invested in property. So they're quite an interesting read if you want to get a good idea of how a whole heap of different people started themselves in investing. There's obviously some opportunity for people, no matter what their background, to get some cash. Why would they look at property developing over maybe just buying and holding? What are some of the advantages? Well, the best thing about developing is actually creating that equity. So rather than waiting for the capital growth to happen and creating the equity that way, you can create equity through adding value. So that could be just through renovating an existing house and then getting it revalued. Could be with a subdivision and then selling off a back lot, or just keeping the 2 lots, and automatically as you get it subdivided and registered, it will go up in value. And building new villas as well, you're creating equity through the development process. Sure. And so whenever there's extra profits, normally there's a bit of risk as well. What are some of the risks that you might have of developing rather than just kind of holding on? Well, mainly, I think the main risk is really in your site selection. So you've really got to find the right development site, and you've got to do your homework, and research is so important. I think if it's your first time development, you're probably better off using a project manager and learning the process as you go, and that way you can do your next development and you'll have a lot more experience that way. But it's really about making sure there's for instance, the sewer line. You need to know the exact area the sewer line is running in. You need to look at the aspect of the block, you need to look at the slope of the block, you need to look at the frontage, the width of the frontage, and they're just some of the things you need to look. So finding that first site is very important. Yeah. And also getting a real good handle on your building costs. That's the other area that costs can blow out. And so we're always talking about surrounding yourself by like-minded people and the right kind of professionals. What kind of professionals might you need on a property developing team rather than just your general buying? Well, the first thing you need is a really good accountant, property accountant, because you need to run the figures, make sure that it's all feasible in the first place. You need to be buying under the right structures as well, so you need some really good accounting advice there. You need a good property solicitor. You need a surveyor. Now, my surveyor is like my right-hand man, really. So they've got a really good general knowledge of that area that you'll be developing in, and you could go to them with a whole series of questions when you first find a site. Having that survey done, having an accurate contour survey done is really important, so that the surveyor does that. Also, part of your team will be obviously financiers, very important part to make sure you get the best loan and best construction loans. Not all the lenders will do construction loans. And then on to your agents. You work very closely with local agents when you're buying. Other developers in the area, I work with a lot of other developers where I can buy land straight from them, and we often share a lot of knowledge. And right through to having a quantity surveyor do your depreciation schedules at the end, and a project manager too if you think it's all a bit too hard. Sure.
And we'll pull up a graphic about what to look for, because you obviously mentioned finding the right site is the most important thing. One of the first things you put on there was slope. Is it something you want or you definitely don't want? I assume with the slope you might be getting more of a view, but harder to build on maybe?
Yes, well, you actually want a very slight slope. So the land should be sloping to the street so you could drain it well. If you have a very flat site, you may end up having to build up that site and bring in a lot of fill, which will add costs to your building costs. You don't really want a backward sloping site if you can help it. But it all comes down to where that sewer line is located on the site as well, so that's really important. The frontage, the wider the frontage, the better. Generally, you know, you can develop narrow sites, but it is a bit harder and it will add to your cost because you've got to run a longer driveway to access the back units, for instance. The size of the site, I always say bigger is best. The more land you have, the more flexible you can be in your design process. So, yeah, there's some the service connections, of course. You want to make sure that you have all the services readily available to that piece of land, and do your own research on that, because sometimes people do think that, you know, something basic like electricity is available if you're doing a subdivision for once. So you must make sure that happens. And the zoning, of course, you must be developing in the right zoning, so you've got to look at that.
Sure,
well.
And we'll try and see how we can jump into being a property developer without risking the whole of our lives. What are some of the easy options that people can take that first step?
Well, simply a house renovation is a great way to start. You can add a lot of value through renovating a house and actually just adding another bedroom to that house. So that'll create a higher yield for you, better rental return, and you can have it revalued after you finish. You can combine that renovation by actually building, if you've got a big enough piece of land, building some new units or a duplex behind the house, or if it's a corner block, that's even better. And then with that building of that new product, you've got equity that you create through that, and then if you subdivide as well, that equity is then increased. Simple dual lock is a great little investment to start with.
What does a dual lock mean?
Well, dual occupancy means when you're building two dwellings on one piece of land, and then you can subdivide that either through Torrance title subdivision or through strata subdivision. And that's quite a simple way to do that, to start off with a little development. And there's the old granny flat. Putting a little granny flat at the backyard gives you dual income, so you've got increased rental return already from the granny flat.
Now, do you want to explain this? Because this was a recent change, isn't it? And it's called the New South Wales Affordable Rental Housing SEP, the State Environment Plan Policy. In layman's terms, what does that mean?
Well, that's right. It's just a new policy that the government have actually brought in to actually promote affordable housing. Our rental markets are so tight, so they're actually wanting to encourage investors and developers to add a granny flat to their property if there's space. Now, some of the requirements are, really the minimum lot size is only 450 square metres, so you can start from anything above 450 square metres. The maximum size of the granny flat is 60 square metres. So you can
do you have to put a granny in it, or you can pretty much rent it to anyone?
No. What we're doing up in the Hunter is actually having two separate tenancies. So we have a separate electrical meter and water reader. So you can have two separate tenants, or it will appeal also to a tenant who may have a granny or a teenager, or even a relative who just wants to live with them or live close to them. So it's a really good way of creating high yields. It's actually a yield strategy rather than an equity creating strategy. So we're creating around 9-10% gross yields by adding this granny flat onto a property.
And with the loan sizes, even the low doc loans that Damien was talking about before, then that's certainly positive cash flow.
Absolutely.
So what's the rough process to get involved if you want to have one of these granny flats in your back garden?
Well, one of the first steps, what we're doing, we have a new strategy where we're managing this for clients. So we're searching for suitable property that need a little bit of an upgrade, but not too much, so we're not spending too much on the renovation. And we're looking for complying development. So this is important because it means that you can actually get your DA approved within 10 days without going into your local council, but using a private certifier. So as long as that property is complying, you can go straight to your private certifier, have the DA approved within 10 days and start building.
Because that's one of the hassles hassles about being a developer is dealing with councils.
Yes.
And as much as I like councils, they're pretty hard to deal with, aren't they?
Well, it just draws out the process. So if you can, time is money. So if you can fast track that DA process and have it within 10 days, that's awesome. So yeah, as soon as you can get the DA approved, you can start building, have the flat finished and tenanted.
Yep. We'll go through an example in a second, but Damien, very quickly, when it comes to developing and constructing, do banks suddenly have a bit of a nightmare and get a bit nervous when people ring up and say, oh, I'm thinking about doing some building?
Oh, look, it very much depends on the bank. It depends on the site, as you say. It depends on the state. But there is certainly a concept called construction loans that are available for small to medium-sized developments that allow you to draw down the balance of the loan in keeping with the payment schedule that you've got to make to builders and other suppliers. I think once you get past a certain size of development, we're no longer talking about the home loan lending market. We are talking about commercial investment by the banks, and that's a very different kettle of fish, and certainly one where almost every deal is negotiated. It's not a matter of banks having standard or published rates at that level. At that level, they're doing a lot of individual assessment of a project and making an individual case-by-case decision about what to charge you, both in fees and rate.
Because I know of some of the blocks that I deal with, then as soon as I've got over, as one person owns more than 3 units, then the banks say, well, that's kind of getting into commercial.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it doesn't mean that they're not open for business. And I think in many circumstances they're keener on that than they are on lots of other kinds of small business investments, because as I say, as you said in your tip of the week, it's more tangible than the value of a company in many ways. But you are going to go through a lot more individual negotiation, and you'll have a lot more scrutiny, I guess, from a bank wanting to look at every aspect of the project and projected cash flows.
Yeah, we're actually finding that anything up to 3 villas is fine with the main lenders, and anything over that, it does get a little bit more tricky. I have found, actually, funnily enough, you've mentioned RAMS earlier for the low doc lending. They do have very good construction loan as well. They've actually brought back the concept of tentative on completion valuations, which were done probably 6-7 years ago by the major lenders, and so they'll value a development site as if it's completed and then lend you 80-90%.
Rather than so it might cost you $100,000 to produce it, but it might be worth 150 afterwards. They'll do it on the 150 rather than on the 100.
Exactly, and that's great because it'll maximise your finance, so you don't have to put as much money of your own money into the deal.
Yep. So let's pull up a graphic with some of the numbers, and I know it's Friday night, but we'll look at some of the hard numbers on a Friday night. Okay, so we're looking at a 3-bedroom house to start with for $205,000.
Yes, this is for a granny flat development. So if we're in the areas that we develop in the Hunter region, we can get a 3-bedroom house for about $205,000. Anywhere from $190 through to $220 is the range we look for. You've got your stamp duty, your survey, your pest and building report costs of about $8,000. And then we look for houses that only need a bit of a cosmetic reno, so a bit of a paint job, some repairs, new carpets, so $5,000 for your renovation, and then only $2,000 for the use of a private certifier if it's a complying block. So we have to make sure that's a really important bit, really, if you want to fast track this granny flat style development. So only $2,000 for the DA costs, and we have a builder with a fixed price contract of $77,000 to build the 60 square metre granny flat. So it's only just under $300,000 for an investment.
Yep. So no, that certainly looks good and reasonably simple. You mentioned complying block. How do you know if it's going to work on that block or not? So if you're... Because does it change from state to state and suburb to suburb? Yeah,
well, it will with council to council. So the important thing is to have a look at your 149 certificate, the planning certificate that's in the contract for sale, and in there it should tell you whether the land is complying or not. And if you're not sure, you can't find that in the certificate, just ring the council and ask them. They should be able to explain that to you. So
it's a fairly straightforward thing. So as we were saying on there, the total cost then is $297. What might you expect it to be worth afterwards, or is it dependent on the banks?
Well, that's a good question, because we're adding a granny flat. Now, with a granny flat, you can't, under this SEP, you can't subdivide, so it's still going to remain on one title. I've spoken to a few valuers about this and some agents, and really the valuer's answer was that they would value the property with the upgrades that you've put on it, so the cost of the granny flat and the renovation, so it's not really creating you equity there. However, if you've got a property that you've added a granny flat to and you're getting a 10% gross yield, then that's going to be appealing if you put it on the market to an investor or to an owner-occupier. So I think that the end value can be pushed up higher. It's just a little bit of an unknown because there's just not that many comparables in the market at the moment.
And actually, we'll take a quick look at the rents because that's, as you said before, that's the main reason for getting it.
Yeah.
So 300 a week for the house, 220 for the granny flat. So you're getting 27,000 a year, which on that cost of 297 is a 9% return. That's a pretty healthy thing. And Damien, I'm seeing you nodding here. From a bank's perspective, that must look like a reasonable deal for someone.
Yeah, it certainly does, and it's, you know, it's provided all the other parts of it stack up. You know, that's the kind of thing that I think most banks are looking at reasonably generous lending towards.
Yeah, so certainly positive out there. I know I'm always talking about buying and holding and all this negative gearing, but look, when you're getting 9% returns and interest rates are 6 or 7, it's certainly appealing. We might just quickly jump to the phone lines, and we'll come back to you in a second. We've got Charles on the phone. Charles, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris.
Hi there, how you doing?
Good, thanks.
Good.
Look, Joe was just talking about properties with granny flats, and that's something that I'm currently looking at, and I was just wondering if the panel had any advice for areas to look at in New South Wales that would sort of give those similar type numbers.
Yeah, sure. What are your thoughts?
The Hunter region, that's my favourite. It is a very affordable. I think you need to look for areas that have a lot of infrastructure investment going on. They've got growing populations. They've got a diverse economy. You know, and the Hunter region does tick all those boxes. So for me, that's a great area to be looking to invest. And it's, you know, quite close to Newcastle, 2 hours from Sydney.
Charles, it's reasonably kind of new information for me. It's not my subject of expertise, but certainly I had a friend that was looking at doing kind of prefab places that were almost pre-built in kits, and I think he was looking certainly around the Bankstown area, somewhere around there, that there were reasonable plots of land. But it's maybe worth looking at something like a Residexton or an RP Data to see where they believe the growth is, and then if you can add kind of extra property and developing on top of being in a growing area at the same time for those larger block sizes, which, look, you're probably going to have to be slightly away from the city, then certainly that's probably a good tip to think about. All right, thanks for the call there. Now, there's always people out there that are confident on the property market, even if it's not necessarily rising. So now we'll ask Joe Chivers about how to try and make a fortune from doing some of the slightly bigger projects. So, Joe, we'll pull up a graphic there with some numbers that you brought along. Do you want to take us through those?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is for a larger development where we're actually purchased a house, 3-bedroom house on a 1,012 square metre block, and that purchase cost was $220,000. This is an actual example of one of the projects we've completed. The stamp duty, setup costs, legals, $10,000. The renovation of that house was actually $9,000. And then what we did, we built a 2-bedroom duplex behind the existing house. So we ended up with a 3-unit development. So the house being one and the two villas of the duplex being the other two. Now, it's still sitting on one title at this stage. So when the banks do look at that, they are looking at it as a 3-unit development. And then at the end, we're subdividing. So the subdivision costs in this case were at $12,000, and we ended up the house on its own Torrens title subdivision. So the client had the option to sell off the older house if they wanted to, and the two villas or the duplex on its own separate Torrens, and then we strata titled those 2 units of the duplex. The total cost of that project was $571,000.
So obviously with the numbers there, look, it looks pretty straightforward and simple. In reality, when it comes to actually trying to find the sites, how much would you pay in due diligence? Like we always say, like no matter what you buy, you should get probably a valuation, a building inspection, maybe a strata. When it comes to these things, what work do you really need to get done?
Well, it's really important to know the area that you're going to be buying in. So you have to do a massive amount of research and due diligence before you develop and before you choose a development site. So you need to, some of the things I do is I subscribe to the local newspaper, so that gives me a lot of information about that local area. I do a lot of research on infrastructure and government spending in the area. You need to know what the resale market's like and what the rental market's like and what the vacancy rates are. So you really do need to spend a lot of time researching. And I guess what Property Bloom brings to this is having done all that research and focusing on these areas because they do continue to thrive.
It makes life easier because say if I just turned up to the Hunter Valley, I'd never done developing, never been to the Hunter, how many months of weekends do you think it would be to have a reasonable knowledge for investing? $571 is still a reasonable amount of money.
Yeah, well, I would say, you know, it would take you probably months to really get your head around that local economy as well, and which suburbs, you know, you might choose an area, but then you've got to break it down to the suburbs as well. You've got to get a relationship built up with the local agents and get your team on the ground and find a builder as well in the area, and that's no mean feat. So you've got to do a lot of research.
And so really people can either choose to pay the money in time or pay someone like yourselves or a buyer's agent that's done it before to just go off and go and do those kind of things.
That's right, and if you're new to an area, perhaps that's the best way to go for your first one.
Yeah, and we'll pull up another graphic to see what the valuation, so what the end result looks like, and certainly looks pretty healthy there. So 220 for the house, 250 for the villas, so a total of 700 there.
Yeah.
On 571 of cost, so 129 profit.
That's right. So remember, Chris, we paid $220 for the original house. So what we've done here is that's where we've created the equity. So we've spent $220 originally for the 1,012 square metre block. We've renovated the house and we've subdivided. We've built the 2 villas. Yet the house on 400 square metres is still worth the same. Now this doesn't happen in every area, and it certainly wouldn't happen in Sydney because you know, obviously the bigger the land size, the more you're going to pay. But in some areas, some regional areas, this is how it works. So this is how you can create quite a lot of equity through developing.
Yeah. And Damien, when it comes to revaluing things from a bank's perspective, I understand you're not a mortgage broker. Once everything's been done, are they reasonably comfortable and then they're happy to revalue those things? Or will they always say, well, look, you only bought it for 571 with all your costs, so we're only really going to value it at that?
Oh, look, I think in cases like this, again, you are tending to look at things that are going to require more individual attention from a relationship manager or a specialist property person in the bank. So highly likely that they would want to get down on the ground and you know, see what's happening. But remember that they have got a reasonable amount of experience and access to all the same kind of data sources you mentioned, RP data earlier. Those kinds of things are the kinds of things that banks will rely on very heavily to say, okay, well, there are other similar kinds of developments, what happened to them and what's a reasonable rule of thumb valuation. So a combination of individual assessment but also some data from prior projects. I think that's right?
Yeah, that's right. And it comes down to comparable sales. So in this particular market, you can buy a beautiful little renovated house on a smaller block, and people are quite happy for a smaller block. They don't have the, you know, it's less maintenance. So as long as there's comparable sales in the market, that's the most important thing, Chris.
Sure. And the final graphic under this section was the end result there. So 129 grand's worth of equity, a rent return of $750 a week or 39 per annum, 6.8%, which is obviously still healthy, and a big chunk of depreciation there as well.
Yeah, so in this case, you know, great equity. We've created great equity. We've also come out with a good gross yield, a really strong gross yield, so it's probably cash flow positive. And also for people paying a lot of tax, you've got great depreciation in the new duplex and also in the upgrades that you've done to the house.
Yeah. Now, obviously, one of the most important things about running these kind of projects is to be able to get the finance beforehand. We'll pull up Jo's Hunter Valley data to see some of the suburbs that she's been buying in and some of the 10-year growth rates there. Do you want to pick one or two of those and say what's one of your favourites?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think if you look at them all, you can just have a quick... I always go to the 10-year growth rate, and anything over 10%, I think, over a long-term growth is a fantastic area to be investing and developing in. You'll see Aberglasslyn there. That's had massive growth over the last 10 years because it's an area where there's been a lot of new housing go in around Maitland. I really like Maitland. Curry is going to benefit from the F3 link when that goes through. Well, they've already started building that. And Muswellbrook's fantastic, you know, underpinned by the coal mining there and really tight rental market. So actually all of the suburbs have, you know, been performing very well and had very good rental returns.
And certainly affordable, because a lot of those are around the $200,000 or $300,000 mark.
That's right, yes. So that's one of the big reasons that we are developing in the Hunter region.
So certainly do your research, see what else is around there, and yeah, there's certainly some growth there, and hopefully we'll get some more growth for the next year as well. I look forward to seeing you next Friday. Until then, I'm Chris Gray. Good night.